can you see me and can you hear me? Hello. Let me know if I'm here, if you can see me, if you can hear me. Hello to Karan. Good afternoon. Good to know that you can see me and hear me. My phone isn't loading me yet, so it's a bit odd. It feels like I'm not really here. But if you can say hello to me, it must mean I'm here. So, I'm Shri. I'm your English educator for grades 11 and 12. We are almost done with the entirety of the grade 12 English literature portions. We are currently doing the enemy, which is, the biggest lesson in the entire term 1 literature portions. And so we split it up into 3 parts. We finished the first part last week. Today we're going to be doing the second part of the enemy. And today evening we're going to be doing the third part of the enemy. So by today the enemy will be done also. Before we actually get into the lesson, here are a couple of things that you should know about what's happened so far in the enemy, just like a quick refresher. First, we are currently situated right in the middle of the Second World War. Japan and USA are enemies. What has happened is this story is set in Japan, and a US prisoner of war has just washed onto the shore. Sadao, who's a Japanese doctor, and his wife Hannah have sort of taken the injured man from the beach and taken him into their house. And currently there's a big conflict about what to do with the man, whether they should just turn him back into the Japanese officers, although they know that if they do that, he will inevitably get tortured and then killed, or what do they do with him at all? And that's the current conflict that's going on. They've also informed their servants that this man is in their house, and their servants have expressed clear displeasure at the fact that this white man, who is their enemy because he is from USA and Japan is currently at odds with USA, they're warring with USA. And their servants are basically immensely displeased that this man is in the house. So there's some sort of tension around that too. The couple, Sadao and Hannah, are sort of like, okay, what if the servants end up ratting us out? We have children. Sadao is a really well-known doctor. What if he loses his position? What if we get thrown into prison? Lots of conflict, lots of tension. And all of that said, let's get into the lesson. We're going to be reading it, understanding it, and carrying on. As always, if you have questions, leave them for me in the chat and I will definitely get back to you. Sadao, she calls softly. She here is Hannah. She is calling out to her husband because she is currently in the room where they put the white man. And she's basically been cleaning him up because he's really dirty. He's just washed ashore. And she's cleaned him up because partly because she wants to put a quilt on him and she doesn't want the quilt to get dirty, but partly also because Sadao is considering operating on the man, and for that he needs to be clean. And why does he need an operation? Because he has a gunshot wound in his back from when he ran away from prison. You basically shoot people who are running away, right, to try and stop them. So yeah, they shot him. There's a wound in his back. Because of that, he's somehow still alive, but if he is not operated on, he's not going to survive much longer. So Sadao is thinking about operating the gunshot wound. Hello to Daman, is that how I say your name? Okay. Sadao, she called softly. He had been about to come in when she called. His hand had been on the door and now he opened it. She saw that he had brought his surgeon's emergency bag and that he wore his surgeon's coat. "You have decided to operate," she cried. "Yes," he said shortly. He turned his back to her and unfolded a sterilized towel upon the floor of the tokonoma alcove and put his instruments out upon it. So she calls out to her husband, partly because she's afraid of being in there alone with the white man, even though she's not entirely sure why she's afraid, because, well, this man is injured, right? He can't do anything to her, but she still feels incredibly, uncomfortable and anxious. So she calls out to her husband for company. And he's actually been, standing right outside. His hand had been on the door, suggesting that he's maybe, standing outside, hesitating, not yet about to open it. But when she calls, he's sort of like, okay, I have to go in now. So he opens it and he goes in. And she sees, because he's brought his bag and he's wearing his doctor's coat, that he has made a decision about whether to operate on the man or not. And so she's like, "You've decided?" And he says yes, and he says it shortly, which is to say that he doesn't really want to engage in a debate or a conversation about this. He's being a little irritable. He's sort of like, yes, and there's no questioning that or talking about that. It's just decided, and he doesn't want to be asked why he's decided this either. And then he sort of spreads a sterilized towel on the floor. Sterilized, it's basically been he's heated it, and it's safe from germs. And then he puts all of his instruments on the towel. "Fetch towels," he said. She went obediently, but how anxious now, to the linen shelves and took out the towels. There ought also to be old pieces of matting, so that the blood would not ruin the fine floor covering. She went out to the back veranda where the gardener kept strips of matting with which to protect delicate shrubs on cold nights, and took an armful of them. So she goes, she gets the towels for him because he asks, and it's instinct to her, right, to listen to what he tells her to do, because she says she went obediently. And at the same time, she's feeling incredibly anxious, and she's feeling anxious because in deciding to operate on the man, they've decisively taken a step in favor of saving his life, and they are very much expected not to do that because he is very much their enemy. So what does it mean that they're saving the life of their enemy? That's the conflict that's currently going on inside Hannah. But at the same time, she can also think about the house itself. So she's like, oh, okay, if we perform the surgery on the floor, then his blood is going to destroy all of the mats that we've put on the floor, which are really beautiful. So I'm gonna go get extra mats that are kept in the back and bring them in. And they're mats that the gardener keeps to sort of cushion shrubs, plants on really cold nights, so that they don't get too frosted up. So yeah, she goes and she gets those mats. She's really doing a lot of things and thinking a lot of things at the same time. But when she went back into the room, she saw this was useless. The blood had already soaked through the packing in the man's wound and had ruined the mat under him. "Oh, the mat!" she cried. "Yes, it is ruined," Sadao replied, as though he did not care. "Help me to turn him," he commanded her. But then by the time she goes back in the room, she sees that there's pretty much no point in her getting all of these mats because, the moss that Sadao put in the man's wound, it's not enough to actually stop the bleeding. It slowed the bleeding down, but now the blood has soaked through the moss and it's destroyed the mat underneath the man's back. And Hannah is distressed. She's sort of like, "Oh no, the mat, beautiful mat." And Sadao's like, "Yeah, it's destroyed." And he says it it absolutely does not matter to him at all, which is very strange. It's their house, all of these things probably matter to him on usual days as much as it matters to her. But right now he can't bring himself to care about the mat. Does this mean that all he cares about right now is saving the man? Is that his first focus? Does that mean he cares actually about the man that he calls his enemy? We'll find out. "Help me to turn him," he commanded her. She obeyed him without a word, and he began to wash the man's back carefully. "Yumi would not wash him," she said. "Did you wash him then?" Sadao asked, not stopping for a moment his swift, concise movements. "Yes," she said. So she turns him around and he starts to wash the man's back, and he starts to wash the man's back again to prepare the back for surgery. He's making it clean. And she tells him, oh, Yumi, who was supposed to wash him, didn't wash him. She refused because she was like, I'm not going to touch a white man. And Sadao like, oh, did you wash him? And he doesn't stop, right? He is extremely focused on his work. So it's not like he doesn't express any surprise here again, just like he didn't express any emotion a couple of lines earlier about the mat. And Hannah's like, yes, yeah, I did wash him. He did not seem to hear her, but she was used to his absorption when he was at work. She wondered for a moment if it mattered to him what was the body upon which he worked, so long as it was for the work he did so excellently. And she's replying to him, but he doesn't like say anything to her or acknowledge her or respond in any kind of way. So it seems like he completely doesn't like listen to her at all. But he does, right? He even like processes what she says, and she says that she knows this because of the way that he always sort of is so incredibly focused on his work all the time. And for one moment she kind of thinks, okay, does it like even matter to Sadao who he's operating on, as long as he's operating well? And that gives us a hint as to why like all this while Sadao has been like responding to her in this slightly detached manner. He is incredibly focused on his work, and his work is his first priority. He seems to take pride in his work, right? And he cares more for his work than like the person that he is operating on, is what Hannah is implying here. And this means two things. First of all, right here, right now, it means that the fact that this man might die if he doesn't operate, and the fact that if he operates he might be able to save the man, is more about him saving the man than about the man being saved. So he cares to be like an excellent surgeon and so perform the surgery well, and not like let this person die when he could have saved them, right? But it's not really about like caring for the man. Again, as I said, it's about caring for himself and his work and how well he does his work. So we can't really say right now, or really at any point in the story, that Sadao very much like genuinely cares about this man that he's saved, or that he very much like wants to save him, or anything like that. None of that can really be said about like Sadao. What we can say is that his work as a doctor matters to him, and so whenever he has the opportunity to sort of practice it, he will take it and he will do it well to prove that he can do it well. At least that's what we're getting about Sadao from these lines. And Hannah here is also thinking, does he care that the person that he is saving is American and an enemy of Japan? Maybe it doesn't matter to him at all, and that sounds like a good thing, right? And maybe it is a good thing, but to Hannah in this moment it isn't entirely understandable as a thing, because to her it very much matters who the person is that you're operating on. You will have to give the anesthetic if he needs it, he said. I? She repeated blankly. But never have I. It is easy enough, he said impatiently. He was taking out the packing now, and the blood began to flow more quickly. He peered into the wound with a bright surgeon's light fastened on his forehead. The bullet is still there, he said with cool interest. Now I wonder how deep this rock wound is. If it is not too deep, it may be that I can get the bullet. But the bleeding is not superficial. He has lost much blood. At this moment, Hannah choked. He looked up and saw her face the color of sulfur. So clearly the surgery is underway, except Dr. Sadao doesn't really have any assistants right now to help him. He is not in the hospital, and so he asks Hannah to take over, and he's sort of just like, okay, so like if he needs it, you'll have to give him the anesthetic, and the anesthetic is basically to put the man to sleep and make sure he's not feeling the pain, right? And it's very crucial. But Hannah's never given anesthetic before. She's not like trained in this, right? So she's incredibly shocked, and she's like, what? I've never done it. And Sadao doesn't really care anymore. Like, he can't think about like Hannah and the fact that she doesn't have any expertise in this. He's just like, it's really easy, and he's being impatient because like he has a job to do. He wants to get it done, and to him it really is very much easy to like give somebody anesthetic. So when somebody else is sort of like, how do I do it, he's sort of like, just do it. It's this sort of like It's that sort of thing that happens when you're really good at something and you're really familiar with something, and you assume that it'll take everybody else the same amount of effort to do it, right? And you might be entirely wrong about that. You might be entirely wrong about how they'll feel about doing it also. But you just sort of like don't have any sort of patience or generosity for that other person in that moment. And in this case, Sadao is especially impatient because of the situation also. He is performing like an impromptu surgery in the middle of his living room. So it's a bit of an intense moment, and he doesn't have time to really think about like Hannah and her worries or her anxieties. And what he's doing is he's removing all of that moss from the back of the man, and it was staunching the blood, right? It was stopping the blood from flowing. So because he's taking it out, the blood is flowing faster, and he's looking into the wound, and he has like his surgeon's light fastened on his forehead, so it's like a bright light, and like when he tilts his head, the light like falls on the wound precisely. And he's sort of like examining the wound and like talking about what's going on with it, and he's like, oh okay, the bullet wound, like the bullet is still there in the wound somewhere. I'm not sure like how deep the rock wound, which is the wound that the man got when like he went and got smashed on the rocks near the sea. I'm not sure how deep this wound is. If it's not too deep, maybe I can like actually reach the bullet and remove the bullet. And he's like, but like he's bleeding really badly, so it has to be quite deep. The bleeding is not superficial, so as to, which is to say, it's not like surface level. It's not bare like little bits of bleeding. It's quite deep. And he's making all of these observations really clinically, and he goes on like for an entire paragraph, as we see here. He's just like, okay, this, and this is his job. Again, this is what he does all the time. So of course, like he's going to be able to list it really clinically, and like he's used to being calm when in the middle of a surgery. But Hannah is not, and she is watching like an operation for the very first time, and so she chokes, like she's feeling incredibly nauseous, and he looks up and her face is the color of sulfur, which is yellow. So she is entirely on the verge of like puking. Don't faint, he said sharply. He did not put down his exploring instrument. If I stop now, the man will surely die. She clapped her hands to her mouth and leapt up and ran out of the room. Outside in the garden, he heard her retching, but he went on with his work. He looks at her, he sees that she's not dealing well with this situation, and he's sort of just like, don't faint. I can't do anything about it if you faint. I can't stop working on this man, because if I stop, he will die, and you fainting is not worth him dying, so make sure you don't faint. That's not entirely in her control, but he is giving her the instruction because he also wants her to know that like it's not possible for me right now to prioritize you. I have to prioritize my work and this man that I am operating on. And so he is like looking at her, he sees that she's sick, and he cares very deeply for her, as we've already found out. So it's not the best of situations, but he's still focusing on what he has to do. And Hannah like listens to him, right? And she processes what he's saying, because she's like, okay. And she leaves the room, and she goes outside and she pukes, and he hears her puking, and he carries on with his work because he knows he has to. It will be better for her to empty her stomach, he thought. He had forgotten that of course she had never seen an operation, but her distress and his inability to go to her at once made him impatient and irritable with this man who lay like dead under his knife. And Sadao is still in that clinical frame of mind where he can look at things a little more like distantly and analyze them, and he's sort of like, okay, well, you know what, if she pukes, it's actually better for her, because like then if she's inside the room, she won't like want to puke again. And he's like, right, she's never seen an operation, so of course like this is freaking her out a little bit. I'm kind of just digging into this man's back. But he's still like incredibly upset by the situation, because he knows that Hannah is quite clearly like in like distress right now. She is physically like upset, and he is extremely upset about that, both because she's upset and because he can't go and help her, right? And that's making him really frustrated at the man who's under his knife. It's like, you know, sometimes duty sort of prevents you from like doing what you really want to do in that moment. And in this case, what duty he feels he has to his work and to the man under his knife is stopping him from going to the woman that he loves and taking care of her, and that's making him irrationally angry at the man who is under his knife. This man, he thought, there is no reason under heaven why he should live. Unconsciously, this thought made him ruthless, and he proceeded swiftly. In his dream, the man moaned, but Sadao paid no heed except to mutter at him. And that frustration causes Sadao to sort of like be angry at the man and say something like, why should this man even live? Like, there's no reason why he should live. Which is maybe a terrible thought to think about another human being, but also an understandable one for Sadao to think in these circumstances. This is an immense inconvenience to him. In fact, it's even a threat to his life, to life as he knows it also. And that this man is now here and in his hands and somehow become his responsibility, all of this is incredibly terrible for him. And so in that moment, he wishes the worst on the man. Doesn't mean that Sadao is a bad person or anything like that. It just means that in moments like this, we all have like terrible thoughts that we can't necessarily like help, and they're very understandable thoughts. Sadao sort of like starts like working faster because of that. He's angry, as we've already talked about. He's sort of like, oh, this man doesn't really matter. Why does he matter? He doesn't matter to me especially. And so he becomes a little more careless, and he just like goes ahead with his work fast, and that clearly causes the man some pain because the man moans even in the middle of like being completely unconscious. And Sadao just like ignores the fact that he is in pain and carries on with his work. Some very interesting things here, and I'll talk to you about them in a moment. The primary thing that's like quite interesting in this particular paragraph is that Sadao is sort of like reacting like this in the moment, right? Until now, he's operating on the man to save his life, but in this moment, he's like, why should I save his life? And so we see how like very small things in our circumstances and our environment can kind of alter the things that we're thinking. That sort of like flux that Sadao is in, when he's like, what should I do with him? Should I save him? Should I leave him to die? What should I do? What should I do? All of that, like the answer to that is decided by a variety of factors, right? And one of those factors could be something as small as your irritation in a particular moment of time, due to like circumstances that are completely beyond everybody else's control. And we see the representation of that in this particular moment. Groan, he muttered. Groan if you like. I'm not doing this for my own pleasure. In fact, I don't know why I'm doing it. And Sadao was sort of just talking to the man, and he's like, fine, be in pain. I don't care that you're in pain. I'm not doing this to make myself happy, which is not entirely the truth. In one sense, he is doing it for his own satisfaction and his own like satisfaction in his skills as a doctor, and also something about how he feels responsible because he is a doctor to save this man's life. But he hasn't quite caught on to any of these things yet. He's not really thought about like the reasons that he's doing any of this. He's not had the time to. It's been quite a crisis. He's just been making decisions before thinking about them. And that says something about Sadao. The decisions he's making aren't really like bad ones at all. But his thought process hasn't quite caught up to his decisions. And so he's like, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I'm doing it. The door opened and there was Hannah again. Where is the anesthetic? She asked in a clear voice. Sadao motioned with his chin. It is as well that you came back, he said. This fellow is beginning to stop. She had the bottle and some cotton in her hand. But how shall I do it? She asked. Simply saturate the cotton and hold it near his nostrils. Sadao replied without delaying for one moment the intricate detail of his work. When he breathes badly, move it away a little. Hannah comes back in, and now she's speaking in a clear voice, which suggests that, the retching actually has helped her. Now she's like prepared to deal with the situation, and she very openly is like, where's the anesthetic? Like, I can hear him groaning. I'm willing to like help you. Tell me how to do it. And so I was like, oh, okay, it's right there. I'm glad you came back. And yeah, this man is sort of starting to wake up. And she picks up the bottle of anesthetic, and she has some cotton in her hand. She's asking her to, actually anesthetize. This time she's not saying, I don't know how to do it. She's saying, how can I do it? And the difference between the two is that one is a way of saying the first, namely, I don't know how to do it, is a way of saying, but I don't want to do it. Or showing fear or anxiety or a sort of like inhibition from actually doing the task. And here she's showing instead sort of an openness and a willingness to sort of actually do the task. The reframing it in the form of a question immediately brings like that much of a change in the sort of tone that's coming across. And so now instructs her, again he's so focused on his work, but he still instructs her. He's like, dip like the cotton in the liquid and hold it near his nose, and if he starts to like seem like he can't breathe, then move it away. I'm going to check to see if you have any questions. Hello to Danish. Okay, you have no questions, I see, so let me keep going. She crouched close to the sleeping face of the young American. It was a piteously thin face, she thought, and the lips were twisted. The man was suffering whether he knew it or not. Watching him, she wondered if the stories they heard sometimes of the sufferings of prisoners were true. They came like flickers of rumor, told by word of mouth, and always contradicted. So she's, sitting very close to his face, and she's observing his face, and she realizes that he is incredibly thin, suggesting that he's been incredibly starved. He's not like been able to eat for a while, and his lips are twisted to indicate that he's in pain. And so she's like, whether he's conscious or like unconscious, whether he knows that like currently he is being operated on or not, he's still in pain. And his body knows it, whether or not he's awake to know it. And as she's looking at him and as she's observing his thinness, she's sort of wondering if like some of the rumors that like the people of Japan hear about the prisoners that the Japanese government takes are true. She says that they come like flickers of rumor, which is to say that, people pass them around by word of mouth. It's like street gossip, and always contradicted, which is to say that there's a lot of confusion about what's true, what's not true, if any of these things that they're hearing about how prisoners are suffering is true at all. In the newspapers, the reports were always that wherever the Japanese armies went, the people received them gladly, with cries of joy at their liberation. But sometimes she remembered such men as General Takema, who at home bet his wife cruelly, though no one mentioned it now that he had fought so victorious a battle in Manchuria. If a man like that could be so cruel to a woman in his power, would he not be cruel to one like this, for instance? And Hannah is giving us some insight on the political situation in Japan. She's talking about the things that the newspapers are saying about Japan, which is that, wherever the Japanese armies go, people are incredibly glad to like have them there. They're always sort of like delighted. They say that like Japan has freed them from the, from German occupation, basically from, and that's what like all the newspapers are reporting. But Hannah says, is this really true? Like, well, maybe it's true that like the people of those places are incredibly happy to be freed from wherever like they've been, from whoever has been occupying them. But do we really treat everybody well? Like, does that mean that Japan is just consistently good to everyone, and that Japan is basically like some godlike figure for everyone? And she thinks not. And she thinks not because she's thinking about one specific political leader, who is General Takema, who's won like a really like great battle recently. And so, like, because he's won a really great battle, all of this sort of rumors about him, all of this sort of talk about the bad things that he does have been swept under the carpet. But she knows, and she still remembers, that he beats his wife at home. And she's sort of thinking, well, you know, if he can be that cruel to somebody at home, then why wouldn't he be cruel to complete strangers? And this is a very full paragraph, right? It's telling us about a lot of things. It's telling us, first of all, about the sort of propaganda, media propaganda, that nations feed their own people about the work that they're doing. The people of Japan, in this case, are meant to believe that Japan is wonderful, that they are in fact doing good things for the rest of the world, that they would never ever injure another person, that they are definitely just like taking care of everyone and making everybody's lives better. It's the same sort of rhetoric that Britain used to use once upon a time when it went out and colonized different places. Like India, it thought that it was bringing India civilization, right? So very much the people of England were convinced by their government that, you know, what their people were doing was very much right. That this was the only good thing to do, the moral thing to do. And that's what the Japanese people are meant to be convinced of too. But as always, it's impossible for like one version of the truth to be the only version that like is definitely known. People talk and people think, and because people talk and people think, inevitably like rumors do fly around on the grapevine, and like people do hear that, oh, maybe like the Japanese government is treating some people really badly. And you know, then people justify that sometimes, but some people don't justify that. And Hannah clearly is like thinking that it's important to think about the sufferings of prisoners. And she's wondering like whether she should listen to those rumors rather than necessarily those newspapers. You know, and that's always the conflict, right? Do you listen to that one story that the government's media is sort of giving you, or do you listen to everything that's sort of going around, look at the evidence for yourself and make a decision about what might be like the more accurate turn of events? And here Hannah is using the evidence that she has, which is that one political leader that she knows, for instance, is cruel, has in fact been known to be terrible to people whom he has any kind of power over, even people who are incredibly close to him, like his own wife. And she looks at that example and she thinks, people like this, they could definitely be cruel to other people. So it definitely makes sense that this other story that I'm hearing from like people on the street about the sufferings of prisoners makes sense. And looking at this man, she's gotten another piece of evidence, right? He's really thin, he looks like he's not in very good shape, and she's sort of like, maybe people have been cruel to him, and maybe he has been tortured. So yeah, this is an excellent example of like looking at the evidence that you have and sort of re-evaluating like maybe what you think the truth is. She hoped anxiously that this young man had not been tortured. It was at this moment that she observed deep red scars on his neck, just under the ear. Those scars, she murmured, lifting her eyes to stare. And Hannah's sort of like thinking all of this, and she's sort of like, oh, I really hope this man hasn't been tortured. And at this moment, she sees scars on his neck, which suggest some sort of torture, right? And she doesn't mention what they are. She just like says, oh, those scars. And she looks at Sadao. And it's one of those moments when you've kind of noticed something horrifying and you want somebody else to confirm what they think it is for you before you say what it is out loud, because you're terrified that it might be what you're afraid that it is. And this is a very interesting insight on the character of Hannah. All this time she's like, we should just give him back to the police. We can't care about him. We should just throw him back in the ocean. We should just leave him to die. But now she looks at him and she's like, I hope he's not been tortured. And telling, right, that she still somewhat cares, and she still somewhat cares also, I'm sure, that her country isn't doing terrible things like this. If they must keep like prisoners of war, then can't they at least just keep them in like a condition that's not going to be terrible? a condition that means that Hannah can sort of look away and think, oh, those people are fine, they're just in prison for like crimes that they've committed. But torture like takes it a step beyond that for Hannah, clearly, and it's something that she finds distressing. I'm going to look to see if you have any questions about that. The general to Sadao about Americans and Japanese. Yeah, Kushali, I know what you're talking about. That is in part 3, so we'll be doing that in the evening. But yeah, come back at like, I think 6 is when the third part is happening, and like we'll talk about that line as we're like talking about the conversation between Sadao and the general. But he did not answer. At this moment he felt the tip of his instrument strike against something hard, dangerously near the kidney. All thought left him. He felt only the purest pleasure. He probed with his fingers, delicately, familiar with every atom of this human body. His old American professor of anatomy had seen to that knowledge. Ignorance of the human body is the surgeon's cardinal sin, sirs, he had thundered at his classes year after year. To operate without as complete knowledge of the body as if you had made it, anything less than that is a murder. But Sadao doesn't reply because he's at a very crucial point of the operation. He is moving his surgical instrument around the man's back, and he finds it like strike against something hard, and hardness in the body, like on the inside of the body, like past the bones, suggests that it's the metal, right? The bullet of the gun that's like gone into the man's back. So he's found the bullet, and he even knows where it is. He knows that it's near the kidney. And the reason that he knows it's near the kidney is because he is incredibly familiar with the human body. He says, familiar with every atom of this human body. It's not only the Americans, it's any human body, right? He has learned incredibly well in university. And he says, in fact, that he owes this knowledge to his old American professor of anatomy, body parts. Very interesting, like circle, like a little cycle. He learned this in America, and now he's operating on an American. Very interesting. And also a reminder that at one point of time, Sadao didn't consider America his enemy or Americans his enemy, because very obviously here he learned from them. Or even if he considered them his enemy, he still could live among them and learn from them and take them seriously. Very interesting stuff. And we'll talk about that when we hit the end of the lesson, that awkward place between meeting personal individuals of a country that you're supposed to hate. And yeah, his professor basically yells at his classes year after year, and he's like, if you're a surgeon, then you can't ignore the human body. If you operate without knowing the body completely, knowing the body as well as though you had put together every piece of it and so knew what each piece of it was, if you have knowledge that is less than that, then you are going to commit murder. And what he means by that is, you performing surgery is going to be incredibly dangerous and terribly risky if you don't know the body incredibly well. Another interesting thing that we get from this passage is, all thought left him. He felt only the purest pleasure. Why is he feeling pleasure? Because he's found the bullet. His operation is on the verge of being a success, and he is no longer thinking, which means that he is operating on the level of instinctual knowledge. He is so well trained that he can do that, right? He doesn't have to think about what to do. And this contradicts very much something that Sadao just said. He said, I'm not doing this for my own pleasure, but very much whether or not he is doing it for his pleasure, it is giving him pleasure, right? The act of operating and the act of succeeding in operating is definitely giving him pleasure, and we have it straight from Sadao's mouth here. Alright, my screen has frozen, so I'm going to read out to you from my phone. Give me a moment. Hello to Devaki, whose name is Prasanna on YouTube, I think. Hi Devaki, nice to meet you. Okay, it's unfrozen, which is great. I hope it's unfrozen. It is not quite at the kidney, my friend, Sadao murmured. It was his habit to murmur to the patient when he forgot himself in an operation. My friend, he always called his patients. And so now he did, forgetting that it was his enemy. Okay, my laptop is just going on and on and on, but hopefully, yeah, it started working again. Okay, great. And Sadao is kind of talking to his patient because that's what he does all the time. He just talks to his patient, and because he's so focused, he's not really thinking about what he's saying, so he's sort of like updating the patient on what's going on. And he wouldn't do this if he was actually focused in the moment, because it would be a little odd to talk to somebody who's completely under like anesthesia, right? Not necessarily, but it would be considered odd. And so he's telling the patient, oh, it's not at the kidney, so it's not dangerous. And he uses the phrase, my friend, which is something that he calls his patients all the time, which is one way of putting your patients at ease, right? When surgeons or doctors work with people, they want to make sure that the people who they're working with are comfortable. And in that same way, he says, my friend. So in that moment, he forgets that this person is an American. He forgets that an American should be his enemy. He forgets everything except that this is a patient of his and he is the patient's doctor. And his foremost responsibility is to operate successfully on the patient and make sure the patient makes it out alive. So at this level of like taking care of like somebody, at this particular level of like focusing on your task, all of those externally like constituted ideas of like who is a friend, who is an enemy, oh, Americans are my enemy, all of it's disappeared. All of those like social conditioned ideas gone, everything gone. Only thing that matters, saving this person. It's brilliant, this passage. It's a way of like reminding us that at some level it is completely possible for us to get past this idea of looking at somebody and thinking they are my enemy because they belong to another country. It's a way of telling us that at some fundamental level, we are ultimately all human beings, and ultimately life is something that we all share. That connecting factor is enough to overcome and overpower any of those external boundaries that we sort of constitute, right? Where we're like, oh, I'm from this country and that person is from another country, and so we definitely shouldn't be friends because like our countries aren't friends. All of that absolutely irrelevant in this moment. It's a beautiful, beautiful moment. Checking for questions again. Yeah, Kushali, that's a great question, right? Why is it his enemy? It's his enemy very much because the American is very much his enemy because he is the enemy of Japan. And you're right in that that's not how things should be. It's not necessary that's how things should be, but very often when we grow up in a particular country and we are brought up sort of being told, oh, you're Japanese and so you will hate Americans. You are Japanese and so you will hate Americans. You are better than Americans and so you will look down upon them. If you're being brought up being told those things, then you're going to like grow up thinking, okay, I'm supposed to hate each and every American ever, and the only way I can ever think of an American is as an enemy. And that's not like to say that Japan's the only country doing it. Like back then during the World War, every country does it all the time, and it's pretty tragic that we do that at all, because beyond all of those like country and national borders business, it's entirely possible for us to be friends with each other no matter where we come from. Then quickly, with the cleanest and most precise of incisions, the bullet was out. The man quivered, but he was still unconscious. Nevertheless, he muttered a few English words. With like an incision that is like sort of like a sharp like insertion cut into the skin. Sadao like pulls the bullet out, and the man is sort of like shaking, but he's still like out of his like, he's still like blacked out. He's still shaking. He's only shaking because his body is still feeling the effect of it. And he mutters like words, like we sort of mutter when we're dreaming or when we're daydreaming, when we're not completely like, not daydreaming, sorry, when we're dreaming or when we're half asleep, you know, that like limbo state where you're muttering things and you don't know what you're saying. Yeah. And he's saying guts. They got my guts. And this seems, it's a very drastic sort of phrase to mutter. They got my guts, and that sounds very bloody. And it seems to go some way towards like reaffirming Hannah's worry that like this man may have been tortured, right? They got my guts. Sounds like they've done something terrible to him. Sadao, Hannah cried sharply. Hush, Sadao said. And Hannah is shocked, probably both by the fact that he is talking when he is supposed to be under anesthetic, and so she's worried that he's awake. She's anxious that he's a white man and he is awake in her house, but also she's sort of like anxious that he's awake because they're in the middle of performing an operation. And also she's just been thinking about torture, and this man says this thing about like how people took his guts, and it like seems to sort of hit at that worry of hers, right? So it's like an instinctive rush from her. She's just like, Sadao, you know, like, oh my god. And Sadao sort of like, sure, like, let me focus. And also sort of like, it's going to be fine, like he's not going to wake up, you know, all of that is implied in hush. Don't panic, basically. The man sank again into silence so profound that Sadao took up his wrist, hating the touch of it. Yes, there was still a pulse so faint, so feeble, but enough, if he wanted the man to live, to give hope. So the man sinks into silence, and it's such deep silence that Sadao is sort of like, oh no, has he died? And then he has to pick up his wrist and like feel the pulse to see if he's still alive. And Sadao says he hates the touch of the wrist. Why does he hate it? Again, white man, American, associating with his enemy. All of those things, right? He feels that pulse, and he's sort of like, it's really faint and it's really feeble, but if I want him to live, then like there is hope to believe that he will live. The pulse is strong enough that it's likely that he will live. But he is still adding that clause, right? If I want him to live. But certainly I do not want this man to live, he thought. And then after that he thinks, no, but I don't want him to live. So I don't really care if his pulse is there or not. Except he just picked up the man's wrist and checked his pulse. So, you know, and he just performed this life-saving surgery on the man. So Sadao very confused in this moment. And we get like very little sense of like whether he wants the man to live or whether he doesn't want the man to live, and what even like all of this means to him. We'll talk about it like in a bit. No more anesthetic, he told Hannah. He turned as swiftly as though he had never paused, and from his medicines he chose a small vial, and from it filled a hypodermic and thrust it into the patient's left arm. I see your question and I will respond to it in a moment. Okay? Then putting down the needle, he took the man's wrist again. The pulse under his fingers fluttered once or twice and then grew stronger. This man will live in spite of all, he said to Hannah, and sighed. Okay, so I'm going to respond to Nurul's question first. Do they literally mean the guts? We don't know Nurul, right? He is speaking in the midst of like his sleep, and so whatever he says, it's probably not something that makes complete sense. He's just rambling in the middle of his sleep. What it does tell us though, whether or not like somebody literally took his guts, well, they clearly haven't, because he's still very much alive right here. But what it very much tells us is that he is afraid of something terrible happening to him, which suggests that it is likely that he has been tortured, because nobody is necessarily like that deeply afraid of something bad happening to them that in the middle of like their sleep they panic and like speak about it, unless they've been in quite dreadful circumstances. So yeah, that's the kind of like information that line is giving us. Don't take it too seriously. Take it more as an indication of like something else about the story. Hi Anshika, I'm good. How are you? Kushali, what do you mean by it's synonymous with situations we sometimes are in? Let me know. I'm like gonna go ahead and explain this particular like passage. Okay, and you know, Sadao keeps going on. He feels a hypodermic is basically a needle that you use to like insert something into someone's arm. He chooses some vial in his medicine like package and he like inserts it like into the needle, and then he like pushes an injection into like the man's arm, and we don't know what it was, but it's clearly meant to make the man live, right? Because he checks the pulse again after he like injects the man, and the pulse is stronger. So he's given the man this medicine to like make the pulse stronger. Then he says this man will live in spite of all. And you know, this is partly true, right? He's gone through like prison, he's gone through like being shot in the back, he's gone through like being hit by rocks in the ocean. All of that is a lot to live through, but he wouldn't have lived through any of this if it wasn't for the fact that Sadao didn't operate on him in this moment, and if it wasn't for the fact that Sadao and Hannah brought him in. So the fact that he says he'll live in spite of all of it, which sounds almost like he's saying, you know, we tried so hard to kill him, but he just didn't die. It's just blatantly untrue, right? They tried so hard to save him. So it's more like this man will live because of all that we did. But Sadao isn't willing to recognize that, and he never recognizes that at any point across the story. The young man woke, so weak, his blue eyes so terrified when he perceived where he was, that Hannah felt compelled to apologize. She herself served him, for none of the servants would enter the room. When she came in the first time, she saw him summon his small strength to be prepared for some fearful thing. The man wakes up, like he's gone through like this really terrible thing, but he's okay at the end of it. He wakes up, he sees where he is, he sees the obviously like Japanese features of the house, and he seems very panicked, right? So when Hannah sees him and she sees the panic in his eyes, Hannah's a kind person, like despite like all of her like, oh, let's throw him in the ocean. So she sees the panic in his eyes and she's sort of like sorry, and there's no reason for her to be sorry, but she's apologizing for sort of startling him and for making him afraid, though she didn't really make him afraid. And she is like taking full responsibility for like feeding him and taking care of him, because all of the servants, as we already noticed, completely unwilling to like enter the room or associate with the white man. The very first time she comes into the room, he seems to like be preparing himself for something, almost as though like something bad is going to happen to him, which reiterates that entire fact about him being tortured, right? He sees somebody who's Japanese and the first thing that he feels is fear, like, oh no, something bad is going to happen to me. Don't be afraid, she begged him softly. How come you speak English? He gasped. I was a long time in America, she replied. She saw that he wanted to reply to that, but he could not, and so she knelt and fed him gently from the porcelain spoon. He ate unwillingly, but still he ate. Now you will soon be strong, she said, not liking him, and yet moved to comfort him. He did not answer. And so Hannah, acting on that kindness that is in her, she says, don't be afraid of me, I'm not going to like hurt you or anything. And he asks, how come, you speak English, how do you know English? And he's gasping because like he's still injured, right? He still can't speak very well or like catch his breath very well. She tells him she was in America for a bit, and then she feeds him. He's eating unwillingly, which suggests that he is still like extremely worried of the situation that he's in. He still doesn't know like entirely what's happening to him, and he doesn't want to trust her. But he eats because he has to. And Hannah again sort of like, she looks at him and she sees that he is weak, and she feels some sort of pity for him. And so she says, oh, you'll be strong, like if you eat. And he doesn't like say anything to that. When Sadao came in the third day after the operation, he found the young man sitting up, his face bloodless with the effort. Lie down, Sadao cried. Do you want to die? So they've kept him for 3 days after they've operated on him, even though they were like, after we operate on him, we're immediately going to give him into the police. Sadao comes in, finds the man sitting up, and he's exerted like so much of his energy that his face is bloodless, which means that he's becoming really pale. And Sadao sort of like, why are you sitting up? You don't have the energy for this yet. If you don't lie down right now, like if you try to use up this much of your energy, you are going to die. Your energy needs to be directed towards your healing. He forced the man down gently and strongly and examined the wound. You may kill yourself if you do this sort of thing, he scolded. What are you going to do with me? The boy muttered. He looked just now barely 70. Are you going to hand me over? For a moment Sadao did not answer. He finished his examination and then pulled the silk quilt over the man. I do not know myself what I shall do with you, he said. I ought of course to give you to the police. You are a prisoner of war. No, don't tell me anything. He put up his hand as he saw the young man was about to speak. Don't even tell me your name unless I ask it. They looked at each other for a moment, and then the young man closed his eyes and turned his face to the wall. Okay, he whispered, his mouth a bitter line. I'm going to explain this to you, but I'm looking at your questions first. Kushali, are you asking about Sadao and how he gets confused? Yeah, very much. It's definitely a synonym with circumstances that we're in, right? Sometimes we just don't know what to do. Moral dilemmas. And yeah, Nurul, Sadao and Hana are very much worried about the consequences. If the Japanese police find out that they've been harboring a war criminal, then, as Hana says in the very beginning of the chapter, imagine what will happen to Sadao's position, and imagine what will happen to all of them and their children. They will probably get captured, and it's extremely unlikely what will happen to them. They might get tortured, they might get executed, but whatever it is, they're not going to be let off easily. Okay, I'll explain that, Kushali. Yeah. So Sadao, ever the doctor is sort of like, okay, lie down, and he pushes the man down and he sort of like checks on the wound and he's like, you really can't do things like that. If you use up that much of your energy, you are actually going to die. And he's scolding the man, which is really weird again, because Sadao is so insistent, he absolutely doesn't care. And yet when the man does something that is going to get him killed, he's sort of like, stop that, you're not allowed to do that. So he cares despite himself. And the boy is sort of like, what are you going to do with me? Are you going to give me to the police? And he looks really young, right? He's a soldier, but he's still really young. And that's complicating, like this entire situation also, because if someone's young, then you feel even more guilty about things like handing them over to the police. And Sadao just doesn't reply. And then he says, I don't know what to do. I should give you to the police. You're a prisoner of war. And then he sees the man sort of like about to open his mouth, maybe to tell him, oh no, I'm not a prisoner of war, or oh yes, I am a prisoner of war, this is where they caught me, or I'm a soldier and this is where they got me, or something like that. And he's like, and Sadao stops him. He's like, I don't want to know details, because if I know details, then I'll be complicit, right? And he says, actually don't even tell me your name, because then I'll be complicit. And what is that act of like not asking for information? Saying, in fact, I don't want to know about you at all. Twofold, two things we should take away. One thing is that in speaking to the man, in knowing for sure that he is from X prison or Y prison, Sadao has like definite information on his hands that he is like holding a prisoner, right? Until now, he is making a guess that this person is a prisoner. He is sort of like, he can still get away with like lying to himself and lying to anybody else also about it, and saying, oh, we just found him on the beach and like we saved him. But confirmation of that fact from the young man himself will immediately mean that Sadao is supposed to be actually legally responsible for handing this man over. And the second thing that we get is that he doesn't want to know the man's name, and that's because he doesn't want any sort of relationship with the man. He doesn't want to be friends with the man, partly because he can't form any sort of affection for this man or any sort of relationship with him because he might still hand the man over. And second of all, because if Sadao is ever interrogated on the situation and they say, oh, did you know him? Oh, did you care about him? And knowing his name would sort of be proof of like some sort of care beyond just like saving the life of someone who was almost dying. That's still like acceptable in a very clinical kind of way. But knowing his name makes it personal, and that sort of personal feelings you are not allowed to have for Americans in Japan at this point of time. And the young man recognizes that, and he sees that Sadao like actually just doesn't want to associate with him at all, and that's why his mouth is a bitter line. This person has saved him, they've like taken care of him for this long, but they don't want to know him at all, and they still hate him. And it's a reminder of that, and they hate his country more than him, but because of that they hate him also, and this moment is a reminder of that. And it's a difficult situation to be in, right? To have to be dependent on people who are absolutely like who absolutely despise you. And when they say turn his face to the wall, it's sort of like if this was the wall and I was lying like this, then I'd sort of turn to like look at the wall instead of like looking here. Does that make sense, Kushali? Outside the door, Hannah was waiting for Sadao. He saw at once that she was in trouble. Sadao, Yumi tells me the servants feel they cannot stay if we hide this man here any longer, she said. She tells me that they are saying that you and I were so long in America that we have forgotten to think of our own country first. They think we like Americans. It's not true, Sadao said harshly. Americans are our enemies, but I've not been trained to let a man die if I can help it. The servants cannot understand that, she said anxiously. No, he agreed. So Hannah is waiting outside the door, and when Sadao goes outside, he sees immediately by her face that she's troubled by something, and she tells him, oh, the servants think that they want to leave. They're saying that they want to leave because like they don't want us to hide this American man here, and they're sort of like gossiping about us behind our backs. They're talking about how we don't care about Japan anymore. Japan isn't what comes first for us, and because we were in the West for so long, they think that we now like Americans. And this is the kind of talk that like inevitably crops up, right? If you like, I mean, it's the sort of thing that happens in families. For instance, if you go like to some other part of the world and you get engrossed in some of the culture of that part of the world, and then you come back and you practice it or something like that, they're like, oh, you like that better than our place. You like that philosophy so much that you won't live like how we live, and you don't care about our entire country anymore. In fact, you are now like those people, and you like those people better than you like us. It doesn't have to be a choice like that, but very often we make it a choice like that. And Sadao is also sort of like, well, he's still falling into that rhetoric, right? He's like, no, we don't like Americans. We hate them. He also can't imagine the possibility that he could like an American. And in fact, he doesn't like Americans. He very much like feels quite some frustration and repulsion towards this man. And yet he feels the need to like save the man. And he says, I've been trained to do that. I'm a doctor. I can't let people die. It's my responsibility. And Hannah says, yeah, but the servants won't be able to understand that. And Sadao says, yes, of course they will. And this is a very interesting moment of condescension on the part of Sadao and Hannah. Hannah like does this earlier also. She sort of like makes herself superior to Yumi, and she's like, what? You won't touch the white man? I don't know why you're so afraid of him. I'll touch him. But she was afraid of touching the white man in the first place. And here, she and Sadao are being a little bit hypocritical because they themselves also don't understand why they're doing this, right? And they also considered like letting the man die. But that moment of superiority allows them to feel better about themselves. Neither seemed able to say more, and somehow the household dragged on. The servants grew more watchful. Their courtesy was as careful as ever, but their eyes were cold upon the pair to whom they were hired. Neither of them talk about this anymore. Things go on as usual. The servants watch their masters very carefully. They're still very polite to them, but some of the warmth of the emotion, some of the care and affection that inevitably they have developed over years as they all like work together is gone now. It is clear what our master ought to do, the old gardener said one morning. He had worked with flowers all his life and had been a specialist too in moss. For Sadao's father, he had made one of the finest moss gardens in Japan, sweeping the bright green carpet constantly, so that not a leaf or a pine needle marred the velvet of its surface. My old master's son knows very well what he ought to do, he now said, pinching a bud from a bush as he spoke. When the man was so near death, why did he not let him bleed? So the servants are talking to each other outside the house, and the old gardener is talking, and we get like some context about him. He's worked with flowers for a long time. He's a specialist in moss, so they grow moss like all across like the entire like garden, and he sweeps the moss every day so that bigger plants and trees don't like drop anything on the moss, and it's really clean. So he's great at his work. He loves his work, and he takes a lot of pride in his work, which is very interesting because at the same time he's sort of like, what our master should have done is he should have just let that man die. That young master is so proud of his skill to save life that he saves any life, the cook said contemptuously. And the cook is sort of like speaking to the gardener, and she's like, yeah, our master is so like happy about the way that he can save lives. He's so proud of his work that he just like saves anybody, and he shouldn't do that. Incredibly ironic, right? We get all of these details about how this man, the gardener, takes so much like care with his work, and it's the pride of his life clearly, and yet they're talking about how their master shouldn't take pride in his work. How like you have to be a little more like discerning about things like this, and how because it's an American, you shouldn't have like saved like that person's life. And so there's like the hypocrisy is coming out here very beautifully. She split a fowl's neck skillfully and held the fluttering bird and let its blood flow into the roots of a wisteria vine. Blood is the best of fertilizers, and the old gardener would not let her waste a drop of it. And here we see the cook like cut up like a chicken, a fowl, it could be anything really, it doesn't have to be a chicken, a bird, and the blood is like she's dripping it into a plant because it will fertilize the plant well, and the gardener doesn't like her wasting it. And just like he doesn't like her wasting the fertilizer, the blood of like fowls that have potential to be fertilizer, just like that there's a parallel to Sadao here, and he doesn't want like the life of this man to be wasted, not if he can help it, not if he can save the man. Very interesting parallel in this particular part. What the gardener is critiquing is in fact something that the gardener very much sort of does in a very different way. Nurul, partly it is very much that like Hannah is afraid because of the war. Partly it is also just she is afraid because he is supposed to be an enemy, and so when she sees him and she thinks about the fact that he's in her house, and she's sort of like, oh no, he's in our house, what do we do? And all of that anxiety and that conflict and that moral dilemma, all of it sort of like comes back up. And also they've sort of been trained to like think about Americans as not good and as terrible, and so they shouldn't associate with Americans at all. So being near them like also scares her because she's been told that like she shouldn't associate with them. It is the children of whom we must think, Yumi said sadly. What will be their fate if their father is condemned as a traitor? And Yumi is like, oh no, think about the children. They did not try to hide what they said from the ears of Hannah as she stood arranging the day's flowers in the veranda nearby, and she knew they spoke on purpose that she might hear. That they were right, she knew too in most of her being. But there was another part of her which she herself could not understand. It was not sentimental liking of the prisoner. She had come to think of him as a prisoner. She had not liked him even yesterday when he had said in his impulsive way, anyway, let me tell you that my name is Tom. She had only bowed her little distant bow. She saw hurt in his eyes, but she did not wish to assuage it. Indeed, he was a great trouble in this house. So they're talking about this near where Hannah is, and they know that Hannah is there, and they know that she might hear it, and they want her to hear it. And Hannah knows they know that she's there, and they want her to hear it, right? And she thinks, well, they're right. All the things that they're saying are absolutely correct. These are all like very real concerns, and this is all how like I should live. And yet there is some part of her that she says that she herself can't understand, and it's the part of her that, you know, is letting this man live in her house, that isn't trying to persuade Sadao to turn him in, that sort of just like doesn't really push on it as something that they should do. And even when Hannah says things like, oh, we should like hand this man in, she always says it as, oh, we should do it or else we're going to like get backlash for it. She never says it as, this is the right thing to do and so we should do it. We are Japanese and therefore we should do it. She doesn't speak in those words ever, right? And she's like, what is wrong with me? Because she doesn't understand why she can't think like that the way that she's supposed to. And she says, I don't like him. I still don't like him. And now she calls him a prisoner, and she calls him a prisoner maybe because he used to be a prisoner in like from wherever he's come from. Or maybe she thinks of him as a prisoner because he's simply trapped in their house right now and he's completely under their control. And she says, I didn't like him, like I don't like him. And even yesterday, he'd sort of impulsively like shared with her and said, oh, my name is Tom. And there he's trying to make like a personal connection again, right? He's trying in some way to like get to know the people who are sort of saving him, taking care of him every day. But Hannah doesn't want to get to know him, Sadao doesn't want to get to know him, and that hurt him already, as we can see. And Hannah here hurts him again by not saying anything, just like bows to him, which is a sign of like acknowledgement in Japan, but she's still not engaging with him, and he can see that it's deliberate, and he's hurt by it, and she can see that he's hurt, but she doesn't care to like make him feel better. Assuage means to reduce the hurt, reduce whatever the thing is that is, you know, there. And she's like, I don't want to make him feel better when he's such a pain to me and my life. Okay, we have, I think, 5 more slides, but we are at, okay. It is almost 4:30, so I'm going to like go ahead and like keep going. But you are all like welcome to leave. I understand that like it's exceeded far past class time. Kushali, did what I say make sense to you? I explained come to think of him as a prisoner. It basically just means partly he is a prisoner in the sense that he is from a prison, but he's a war prisoner. But partly also it's the fact that right now he is completely under the control of Sadao and Hannah, and he can't do anything for himself, right? So he's trapped in their house and they're sort of his wardens. They get to decide what to do with him now. Okay, so I'm gonna keep going, but if like you need to go, that's okay. You can come back and watch this later. It will be up for a long time. As for Sadao, every day he examined the wound carefully. The last stitches had been pulled out this morning, and the young man would, in a fortnight, be nearly as well as ever. Sadao went back to his office and carefully typed a letter to the chief of police, reporting the whole matter. On the 21st day of February, an escaped prisoner was washed up on the shore in front of my house. So far he typed, and then he opened a secret drawer of his desk and put the unfinished report into it. While Hannah is undergoing all of this conflict and doing all of these things in the house, Sadao is examining the wound. He sort of removes the stitches. He makes sure the man is good. And he realizes, oh, in 14 days, he's going to be completely okay. He goes back to his office, you know, regularly as he is supposed to. And he starts typing a letter to, like, inform the police that, like, this has happened. And he types the first line. And then he stops typing. And he opens like a drawer in his desk, and not like a drawer where everybody can see that the letter is there, but a secret drawer, and he puts it there. So he doesn't finish the report. He puts it somewhere it can never be seen, and he doesn't seem to pick it back up ever again. So, despite all of their talk about reporting the man and how they're going to report him after he's fine, they feel morally conflicted somewhere after all, and they don't entirely feel comfortable like giving the man in. On the 7th day after that, two things happened. In the morning, the servants left together, their belongings tied in large square cotton kerchiefs. When Hannah got up in the morning, nothing was done, the house not clean, and the food not prepared, and she knew what it meant. She was dismayed and even terrified, but her pride as a mistress would not allow her to show it. 7 days after the man has been in their house, two things happen, and the first thing is that all the servants, they actually enact their threat. They leave. They tie up all of their things in like big sort of like cloth pieces. And she gets up in the morning, Hannah. She sees that none of the work of the house is done, and all of the work is work that the servants usually do. So now that she knows it's not done, she's like, alright, so it must mean that they're not willing to work for us anymore. And it terrifies her, but she's like, I'm not going to beg for them to stay because I'm their mistress. So again, like that sort of pride, that sort of ego here, she's sort of like, I won't show it. If they want to leave, they can leave. It's up to them. I'm not going to beg them. And that's the sort of condescension that she and Sadao have for their servants all the time. It's there at like multiple parts of the story. They're sort of like, oh, but they're like servants. You know, we can't like show ourselves to be less than them. So that's the thing that's going on here right now. One second. Water. Nurul, I'm going to be doing the MCQs for Vistas on Wednesday. Yeah. So all of Vistas is the MCQ that I'll be doing on Wednesday. Okay? I can also do like all of Flamingo maybe. Let me see. I'm not sure about that. But I will definitely be doing like the enemy and the third level like combined MCQ sometimes. You can keep an eye on the Telegram group. The link is in the description box, and if you join it, then I'll send like notifications there. Instead, she inclined her head gracefully when they appeared before her in the kitchen, and she paid them off and thanked them for all that they had done for her. They were crying, but she did not cry. The cook and the gardener had served Sadao since he was a little boy in his father's house, and Yumi cried because of the children. She was so grieving that after she had gone, she ran back to Hannah. If the baby misses me too much, send for me. I am going to my own house, and you know where it is. Thank you, Hannah said, smiling. But she told herself she would not send for Yumi, however the baby cried. So Hannah sort of like shores herself up, she prepares for the moment, she goes, she waits for them, she sees them, she pays them, thanks them. She's very graceful about all of it. She doesn't blame them, she doesn't like ask them to stay, none of it. They're all very upset at what they're doing because, well, two of them have like been part of this family for a really long time. They've been serving like Sadao, working for him for really long, so they have affection for him. And Yumi is upset because she takes care of the children and she's fond of the children. She's so fond of them that she like comes back to Hannah like after she leaves, and she's sort of like, if the baby like, you know, misses me, you can like come get me. I'll come back. I'll help you. You know where my house is. And what all of this tells us is that the servants are basically sticking up for what they think is right. Right? Partly it's that, and partly it's also the fact that, as Yumi said, they're poor and they don't want to get involved in this. The consequences will be a lot more harsh on them than it will be on Sadao and Hannah, and they can't risk getting trapped in this just because Sadao and Hannah did. And they will also be held responsible, right? Because they hid the secret as well. And so they sort of like leave to protect themselves, but it still distresses them. And so Yumi is sort of like, you know, like, I'm still around if you need my help. And Hannah's very proud, right? In this moment, she's like, I won't send for him. No matter what, I'm not going to do it. She made the breakfast, and Sadao helped with the children. Neither of them spoke of the servants beyond the fact that they were gone. But after Hannah had taken morning food to the prisoner, she came back to Sadao. So Sadao and Hannah do all the work themselves. They don't really talk about the servants. They just acknowledge the fact that the servants are gone and carry on with the day. Why is it we cannot see clearly what we ought to do? She asked him. Even the servants see more clearly than we do. Why are we different from other Japanese? Sadao did not answer. And Hannah, again, Hannah doesn't seem to like find this to be some sort of like morality thing, right? She's sort of like, she isn't pushed by that same imperative that like the servants seem to be pushed by. She's not like, we should do this because we're like Japanese. She's sort of like, why aren't we doing this? How do they understand better than us? Why are we different from like other Japanese people? Why can't we just do what we should do? And Sadao doesn't have an answer because he doesn't want to do what like they should do, just as much as Hannah doesn't want to do what they should do. But a little later, he went into the room where the prisoner was and said brusquely. Brusquely means sort of like sharply, "Today you may get up on your feet. I want you to stay up only 5 minutes at a time. Tomorrow you may try it twice as long. It would be well that you get back your strength as quickly as possible." But he goes into the room where the prisoner is and he says, "Okay, today you're going to start trying to like stand. Today 5 minutes, tomorrow 10 minutes. You're going to get your strength back. You're going to start walking again, moving again." And why? Because he either wants the man to like escape or he wants to like throw the man out of his house. He's basically telling the man, we won't take care of you for much longer, so you have to get strong again soon. He saw the flicker of terror on the young face that was still very pale. "Okay," the boy murmured. Evidently he was determined to say more. "I feel I ought to thank you, doctor, for having saved my life." The boy, he's young, he's still very pale, still not got much energy, and a flicker of terror goes across. He's terrified, right, at the thought of being thrown out because he's not in very good shape. And out there he really might die. But he pulls himself together and he's sort of like, okay. And even though at this moment Sadao's like, "I'm going to throw you out soon," the boy's still like, "I'm grateful to you. Thank you for what you did for me." "Don't thank me too early," Sadao said coldly. He saw the flicker of terror again in the boy's eyes. Terror as unmistakable as an animal's. The scars on his neck were crimson for a moment. Those scars, what were they? Sadao did not ask. And Sadao, he's sort of like, he doesn't want to be thanked. He doesn't want to be thanked partly because like he doesn't want to be reminded that he saved this boy's life. He wants to have done nothing at all like that, because again, all of these conflicts about like, should I have, should I not have? So that's why he says that. But he also says that because he's still saying, oh, I'm not on your side. I might still turn you in to like the Japanese police. So don't thank me. It's too early for you to know what I'm going to do with you. Maybe I saved you just to like throw you in. We know Sadao is unlikely to know that, but he wants to pretend that he can be that perfect Japanese man that he imagines himself to be, or that he imagines he should be. But the boy is afraid again, and it's terror as unmistakable as an animal's, which is just deep terror, right? Terror that's like, that's so instinctive that you can't even hide it. And that's why it's being compared to that of an animal. Human beings sort of like learn and train themselves to hide their fear, but this boy is unable to hide this fear, and that suggests that it's as reflexive as like an animal's fear might be. And the scars on his neck are crimson. They're not actually just crimson in that moment, they're always crimson, but he's especially pale now, partly because like he's been terrified by Sadao in this moment, so that makes them stand out on his neck. But also it might just be that Sadao notices them more clearly in that moment, and again, we know that they are likely to have been like evidence of torture, but Sadao doesn't want to know what they are. He just thinks, oh no, what are they? And then he just doesn't ask. He doesn't want answers about it. In the afternoon, the second thing happened. Hannah, working hard on unaccustomed labor, saw a messenger come to the door in official uniform. Her hands went weak and she could not draw her breath. The servants must have told already. She ran to sit down, gasping, unable to utter a word. But by then the messenger had simply followed her through the garden, and there he stood. She pointed at him helplessly. Sadao looked up from his seat. He was in his office, the other partition of which was thrown open to the garden for the southern sunshine. So in the afternoon, while Hannah is working, and again it's unusual work for her, she doesn't usually do it, but while she is doing it, she sees a messenger in official uniform, so from the Japanese government, and she's terrified because she thinks that, oh, the servants left this morning and they've already reported us, and so they've come to like get us. And she goes to Sadao, and she can't even say anything to him, and she has no idea like what she's going to say to him even. But the messenger follows her, and so she just points at the messenger instead of saying anything. And Sadao is working. He's working in like a segment of his office that connects to the garden, and she just like points at this messenger, and he looks up at her when she comes in. What is it? He asked the messenger, and then he rose, seeing the man's uniform. You are to come to the palace, the man said. The old general is in pain again. Oh, Hannah breathed. Is that all? And Sadao's sort of like, what is it? And he doesn't really like, pay attention to the man. And then he sees the man's uniform and he stands up because he also is afraid. And then the man's sort of like, oh, you have to come to the palace because the old general is in pain. And we know the old general is having some sort of serious medical condition that Sadao checks on him for. And Hannah is really relieved. She's like, oh, thank God, that's all. We're not getting like taken away. Oh, thank God. But it's all, the messenger exclaimed. Is it not enough? Indeed it is, she replied. I'm very sorry. And the messenger's like, that's all? You're saying that's all? Our general, who's so important to our country, is in pain, and you say that that's not much at all? And to Hannah it isn't, because she thought she was going to be captured and executed. But the messenger doesn't know that, right? So she almost gave them away in that moment. She acted very suspiciously. But he thinks that she's just underplaying the pain of the general. And so it's fine. And she sort of says, oh yeah, that's very serious. You're right. I'm really sorry. When Sadao came to say goodbye, she was in the kitchen but doing nothing. The children were asleep, and she sat merely resting for a moment, more exhausted from her fright than from work. I thought they had come to arrest you, she said. He gazed down into her anxious eyes. I must get rid of this man for your sake, he said in distress. Somehow I must get rid of him. Sadao prepares and takes all of his things, and he comes to say goodbye to her. She's sitting in the kitchen, but she's not doing anything. Her children are asleep, and she's sitting there because she needs a moment to take a break, right? And she needs that moment not because she's worked very hard or anything, but because she is incredibly freaked out, and that fear has tired her out. And she says it. She's like, I really was worried that we were going to get arrested. And Sadao sort of looks at her. He sees how worried he is, and we know he cares about her very much, right? And he's like, okay, you are so worried, and seeing that worry in you, I don't want to put you through this anymore. And somehow or the other, we're going to get rid of this man, and I'm going to get rid of him for you, for your sake. He's also getting rid of him a little bit for his sake. It'll make his life easier too. But in this moment, it's actually because he sees Hannah in distress, that he can sort of he sort of does something about it, right? Even when the servants left, for instance, Sadao doesn't say anything about it. It's only Hannah's conflict and her saying, why aren't we just doing what we should do? That kind of makes him think, oh, okay, right, I should do something about this. And that's when he goes in and he says, okay, you better start preparing to be thrown out of this house to the prisoner. So a lot of Sadao's actions throughout the story are, he's not determined enough about saving this man's life in order to actually say, no, this is the right thing to do and we're going to do it. But he is also not so invested in the idea of the American being his enemy that he thinks that he should leave the man to die or report him. So he's really stuck in that in-between place. And so what moves him very often is Hannah, or something that Hannah says, or something that happens external to him. And that brings us to the end of the second part of the enemy. Thank you for being here today and for staying for so long. I know a couple of you just like sat here and listened to this for quite a long time. It took all of 1.5 hours, my god. But we're gonna come back in another 1.5 hours and we're gonna finish this lesson off. We'll talk about what happens to Sadao and Hannah and Tom. They never call him that, and that's very telling, right? They don't want to like they don't want him to be entirely human, and that's also why they don't want like details about his life. They don't want his name. They want to be able to think of him as American rather than a person with a life. But yeah, we'll find out what happens to Tom. He's very much a human to us, whatever he is to Hannah or Sadao. And we will find out what happens to the servants also. Before you go, I just want to tell you a quick couple of things about Unacademy. One thing, there's something called Unacademy Plus. It gives you access to a lot of courses, more than the ones that are on YouTube. Lots of live like doubt clearing sessions. You'll have like practice tests and live tests and study materials. Basically YouTube, but expanded with lots more like additional help to finish the grade 11 portions and the grade 12 portions. So if you're interested in getting a usual regular grade 11 or 12 subscription, then these are the prices for the subscription, and you can take it for any duration of time. You can also like take it for longer if you want to like spend less, because the per month cost is actually a lot less if you take the subscription for a lot longer. There's also something called Unacademy Iconic, in which basically you get personalized education. It's like school in the sense that you do all of your subjects with teachers, but it will be just you. It won't be like a group of people with you. It will be you and the educator working on whatever you're struggling with, whatever you need more focus with. So everything will be catered to whatever you need. So you'll get like full attention is on you and working out your needs and your requirements. You get weekly reports also in Iconic, and your parents will also get to be in touch with educators and kind of see what the educators like think of your progress, and you'll get like updates on your progress as well. So that's Iconic, and these are the prices of Iconic. Varied set of prices again for varied durations of time. If you take it for a longer duration, the per month cost is again cheaper. You can also use my code for both these subscriptions, STHAR01. And finally, again, thanks so much for being here. Do leave a like if you liked today's session, and do share it around if you think that it was interesting or informative or both. Hopefully, I hope it was both. But yeah, and do subscribe if you're looking for more content like this, because they're making more content like this all the time. And I hope to see you back today evening in 1.5 hours, maybe after you've gotten some coffee or tea, if that's what you drink. And let's finish the enemy today. See you.